by the time I started teaching, I had been a feminist as a graduate student, but by the time I was teaching at my first job was the University of Saskatchewan, my first real job. By then I was older, and I wouldn't have defined myself primarily as a feminist, though I still, of course, was influenced by many feminist ideas. But and I was teaching in the English department, and everything there is it's predominantly female students, about 85-15, maybe 80-20 female to male, and much of the criticism, the approach to literature is influenced by feminist ideology, even in a soft form. Always the emphasis is on women struggling against, difficult social circumstances and triumphing. And here's a strong woman, and we should admire that. And here are examples of men being unkind to women or male privilege. All of that was just sort of deeply embodied in the most basic assumptions about the stories that we chose and how we discussed them and everything. And although always there's the tradition of male love poetry, for centuries, thousands and thousands of poems about men longing for women, men pursuing women and frustrated by the coldness and the inaccessibility of the woman, or achieving the woman's love and then filled with delirious joy at the prospect of life with this woman, and praising the woman for her beauty and praising the woman for her moral virtues, and all of that, which sits very uneasily on the notion that women have been oppressed by men who didn't care about them and who had contempt for them and objectified them. But anyway, so I think just gradually, as I would look out at these young men in the sitting in my classrooms, and I just started to think what it must feel like to be a 19-year-old boy in this environment that we have, where everything is about women, and we have to promote girls and empower girls, and girls bring something, and boys need to learn, to keep their hands to themselves, and they need to stop objectifying, and they need to stop raping, and we're part of a rape culture, and boys need to get consent, and just all of that, and it's women's time. It's time for young men to take a step back and let their sisters come forward, because the whole history of humanity has been the history of male power and what a mess men have made of the world.
And now what I see, now I see. So where are we at now? Now men and women are changing their genders.
Yeah.
Men aren't having sex. Men aren't having sex anymore in many societies, and less in ours, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they've been so demoralized now that they're not even showing that passion that they used to show. They don't show it anymore. They show less of it now. And now we're starting to, it's come so far now that we're going to deny that there are men and women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the end point of this.
And yes, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah. So that just came to me as I was lecturing, and I wasn't teaching from a particularly strong feminist perspective, but it's there in everything, and the students, and just noticing too that, like, the idea that men are privileged, and even now you'll still see this, that the men speak more in university settings, and they should be encouraged not to speak, and women are so shy and they're so silenced, and it just it isn't the case, and I could see that the women were confident overall. They had a narrative. They had been told that they should speak, and they were strong, and women should be encouraged. They internalized that so deeply, and the men, I could just see that they were certainly not privileged. They were aware that they were the bad guys. I thought it was intolerable. Like, even if it were true, as I, at that point, maybe still half believed, that men of the past had many more advantages than women. But so what if it were true then? It isn't true now. So why would we be punishing these young men for the alleged sins of their fathers? It just started to strike me as what it should strike any reasonable person, as completely unjust and horrible to visit that on young men. And I've noticed this so often. I remember I gave a talk in Renfrew, Ontario, for a wonderful friend of mine named Dave Ainsworth, who had a series of public lectures on issues of social import. And I was talking about the challenges and difficulties facing young men today, and the discrimination that they face, not only the barrage of negative messaging that's everywhere, but the actual injustice of continued affirmative action hiring, where they know that they have to be twice as good in many spheres of endeavor to be hired, because so many places are fulfilling their equity mandates. And, so I was talking about all that, and I finished the talk, and we started having discussion, and a woman stood up in the audience, and I can't remember now exactly what she said, but she told a personal story of something that had happened to her in the 1980s, I think it was, when she was working somewhere, and a man had said to her, allegedly, that she should be at home having babies rather than be working in this, wherever it was. And she brought that forward, and people applauded her, telling this story of some comment that was made 30 years ago or more. And that was, and like, it had nothing to do with what I had talked about, except it was a kind of, so what? This is what happened to me. And so I don't give a damn. Why should I give a damn what's happening to young boys or young men today? That was the whole import of it. And all I could say to her was that, again, I don't believe in an ideology of collective vengeance. Even if it were true that this had been said to her, if it was just said by one person, and maybe it was even well-intentioned, maybe it was a ham-fisted...
Maybe she was tired that day, and he thought maybe it would be nice for her to go home.
Yeah, maybe it was a ham-fisted pickup line. Maybe he was thinking, I'd like to marry you and, give you a nice home. I mean, who knows what it meant?
Who knows, yeah.
It wasn't necessarily, a slight. It didn't necessarily express even, contempt or anything. But she was still angry about it, 35 years later.
Well, if she still remembers it, there was something to it. You know what I mean?
Maybe,
there was probably a spirit of love there that she didn't accept, and now she's still angry. And that also, she couldn't accept it. That's
maybe. Yeah. I mean, who knows?
Right.
And even like what I thought too afterwards was, if that's the worst thing that ever happened to her, that's not very bad. Most people have had worse things than that. Many men have had many worse things than that happen to them in the workplace. So, but it was that, like, just what you were saying about the resentment. It was like she was not willing to listen to statistics about young male suicide, or, male homelessness, or the prison gap between men and women, the sentencing gap. She wasn't interested in any of these social issues. She wasn't interested in the effects of fatherlessness. She wasn't interested in depression amongst young men, because she'd had one incident that made her so angry. And so that was...
And everyone rallied behind her.
Yeah, they did. Like, people applauded. Yeah. And I just thought, wow, I just ended a long lecture talking about men's issues, especially young men.
Yeah.
Declining enrollment, at university. Men are now the minority, like nobody cared. Like, they were more interested.
Well, that's how far we've gone. That's how far down that road we've gone, isn't it?
Yeah.
That you can outline dramatic statistics about the decline of male well-being in our society, and that someone would say something like that, and everybody would applaud. That just shows how far down that road we've gone. And it's time for this to stop. When I was in the hospital and I thought I was going to die, because I was told I was going to die, I asked God, I said, God, if you let me live, I'll talk to people and I'll tell them what I think. And I probably hadn't up till then really truly talked to anybody and said what I think is what the best part of me wants to say. And I would say we've gone a long ways down this road, and it's time to wake up. It's time to wake up. It didn't work. It was an experiment. A long experiment. But it's time to face where we've come to, where we're not having any children. We're not having as many children. We're not even replacing. I mean, Elon Musk is worried that we're not going to have enough people because people aren't having children anymore. Men aren't having sex anymore. People are changing their genders. They're so horrified by being who they are when they're born. Yeah. It's like that experiment has gone wrong, people. Disastrous. It's just gone wrong, and the evidence is in. I mean, I don't know. Yeah.
And
right?
I know that I agree with you, and I know that some people listening might say, "Oh, Janice is she's biased, against."
Yeah, biased. Yeah.
She's not seeing the real suffering of women in the past.
Well, they're suffering. Of course, they're suffering.
Present,
we all are suffering.
Absolutely, but I guess I am biased in the sense that I came through the feminist perspective, and I know how it closed my mind off to the experiences of men. Like you get so focused on this idea that women have, the women suffer in a special way. And then you get to the point where you won't accept that men suffer at all, or even that men are really fully human. Like it is a kind of denial that men are human. And so I rejected all of that as a result of being a teacher and seeing my male students and that. But I never answered your question. I think it was 2012 probably that was my light bulb moment when I saw a protest at the University of Toronto of a talk that Warren Farrell, and I know your husband has spoken to him on at least one, maybe more occasions. And
he wrote a book called The Boy Crisis, right? The
Boy Crisis. And he's just like, he's the god of men's issues in a way. Well, that's a bad way of putting it, but he's got all the statistics. He's done such deep research into all of the issues. And he also wrote an amazing book called The Myth of Male Power, where he really gets into all these situations where women imagine men have power, but actually, it's this really complicated reciprocal thing. And it's never so simple as it's often represented. And anyway, he had come, a men's issues group at the University of Toronto had invited him to speak. And it was just, you can still find video of the protests. Some women's studies students tried to just prevent it altogether, and they were chanting and they went crazy, really, fury and anger, and preventing people from getting in to see the talk. I mean, that's now quite common, but I think it was one of the first times I'd ever seen that. And my friend Steve Brule heard about the talk, and he went down there, he started filming, and he interviewed people that were protesting, and he interviewed some of the young men who had wanted to get in to hear Warren Farrell. And, one of the young men, two of his friends had committed suicide in the previous year, and he wanted to learn more about why young men were committing suicide. And it was just so sad to see him wanting to hear, to have some understanding of what was happening to young people that he knew, young men in particular. And that's what Warren's research was really focusing on at that time. And to be prevented and to be told that he was an oppressor because he wanted to hear Warren Farrell, it was just so outrageous and so unfair and horrible. That was really, and I said, that's it. I'm going to try to, like you, I just thought, I'm going to try to speak from what I know. And so I gave a talk in the following spring, March of 2013. That was my first talk, and I knew nothing. I didn't know what I was up against at all, and the same kind of craziness. The fire alarm was pulled, and there were a lot of really angry people laughing and making faces and shouting at me while I was trying to give the talk and everything. And it's true, I didn't know much about men's issues at all at that point. I just knew that feminist theory wasn't true. But what I wanted to say in relation to the sort of theme of resentment that's gone through our talk is, like, I've been so, I guess, heartened in a way, and saddened too, to speak to many, many men. And from that first talk, people started emailing me, not to the extent probably that you and Jordan get comments, but a lot of people wrote to me to tell me about the experiences that they'd had with feminism, especially men writing about how awful it was to have no ill will towards women at all, and to just want to build a good society, get married, have a family. That was the deepest desire of so many men who wrote to me, both young and old, or men who'd been through horrible divorces where they don't see their children. They haven't been allowed to see their children.
Oh yeah, the system is totally against men.
It's just awful.
In divorce. Yeah.
I met a man who went to South Africa and came home and thought everything was fine in his marriage. His wife had thrown some of his clothes into his car and told him he couldn't come into the house. She called the police. She said that she was afraid of him because he had an antique gun collection. Most of them didn't even fire, apparently. But the police told him he couldn't enter his house anymore. And that was it. She divorced him, and he never saw his children again. And he lost all his money trying to fight her in court. And so that's so typical. I've heard that story so many times. But the thing that is kind of heartening in the midst of all that, and I know that some people will find this hard to believe, but I have not met very many men who are angry at women, or I've met men who are angry at feminism and at some particular feminist women, but I have not found that anger and hatred of women in these men, even the men that have had the very worst experiences. Like, they just want to call it quits. They just want to say, let's just end the gender war. Yeah. They're perfectly fine with the idea of women's equality, at least in the sense of, women, yes, they believe women should be able to do what they're good at. They don't want to, prevent women from becoming lawyers or doctors or whatever women might want to do. They just want to work together with women in peace and harmony, and they want to love women, and they just don't want to be accused anymore or slagged off or told they have to apologize for some imaginary privilege or entitlement that they don't actually have. And it's just, like, I find it remarkable if I talk to a group of women, even women who don't call themselves feminists, or if I talk to an individual woman, like, there's this kind of often automatic dislike of men or something. Like, I just find that women will often say mean things about men as a group and laugh and expect me to join in. Like, it's almost a way women bond now by saying horrible things about men's idiocy or men's uselessness in society or things like that. And I don't find that in the many, many men that I've spoken to, even men who've had these terrible experiences. I just don't find that level of anger, and certainly not hatred and bitterness towards women in them.